It was a sweltering summer afternoon in the heart of Riverdale, the kind of heat that clung to your skin and made the air shimmer like a mirage. The streets bustled with the rhythm of the city. Cars honked impatiently, vendors called out their bargains, and the cheerful shouts of kids playing tag echoed through the neighborhood. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly roasted coffee from the corner cafe, mingling with the faint tang of asphalt and the sweet aroma of blooming roses from a nearby park. Evelyn Harper, a dignified woman of 68, strolled down the avenue with a quiet elegance that turned heads without trying. Her silver-streaked hair, neatly combed back, framed a face lined with the stories of a life filled with trials and triumphs. She wore a flowing lavender dress, simple yet sophisticated, and pinned to its lapel was a delicate bird-shaped brooch, a keepsake from her late husband, a symbol of resilience and peace that she carried close to her heart. In her hand was a cloth bag filled with produce, crisp apples, fresh bread, and a bouquet of daisies she'd picked up after a morning spent at the community outreach center. Evelyn's heart swelled as she thought of the families she had met there, their smiles brimming with gratitude as they shared stories of how the center had helped them. It gave her a sense of fulfillment that made every step feel lighter. As her house came into view, the sound of screeching tires shattered her peaceful thoughts. 2 police cruisers barreled to a stop in front of her charming, well-kept home. Red and blue lights flickered wildly, bathing the quiet street in urgency. Evelyn's pulse quickened, and her grip on the bag tightened. This was her sanctuary, the house where she'd raised her son, Samuel, through thick and thin after losing her husband. Samuel had risen to become the city's chief of police, a man she admired not just for his position, but for the unwavering integrity he brought to it. Evelyn squared her shoulders. Whatever was happening, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her through life's storms. From the patrol cars emerged 2 officers. The first was a broad-shouldered man with a stern, unreadable expression, his sharp eyes scanning the street like he was looking for trouble. The second was younger, fresh-faced and jittery, his hands fumbling with his cap as though it might shield him from the tension in the air. Evelyn stepped forward with measured poise, her voice calm but commanding. "Excuse me, officers, but can I ask what's going on here?" Her words were laced with the quiet authority of someone who'd never let life push her around. The older officer barely looked her way. His voice was curt, almost mechanical. "We've received a report of suspicious activity at this address. We need to search the premises." Evelyn's brow furrowed, her mind racing to make sense of the claim. "Suspicious activity? That doesn't sound right. Perhaps you'd like to wait for my son, Samuel Harper, the chief of police. He'll sort this out." She let his title hang in the air, a deliberate move to temper the situation. The mention of Samuel's name had no visible effect on the older officer, whose demeanor only grew colder. Crossing his arms, he replied with a dismissive edge, "This isn't a negotiation, ma'am." The bluntness of his tone hit her like a slap, but she held her ground. Evelyn wasn't one to be intimidated, no matter the uniform or badge. The younger officer shifted awkwardly, his eyes darting between Evelyn and his partner. He seemed to wrestle with an inner conflict, his face betraying a hint of unease. Evelyn noticed it instantly. Her gaze softened, her tone turning measured but firm as she addressed him. "You're new to this, aren't you? Look me in the eye and tell me if what you're doing feels right." The young man hesitated, his cheeks flushing. The stern officer shot him a glare, but Evelyn's words had planted a seed. She stood tall, unwavering, the embodiment of grace under pressure. The older officer's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. "We don't have time for this," he snapped. But the younger officer stood his ground. "If there's a mistake, we need to clear it up first. She's right. Her son's the chief. We can't afford to get this wrong." Evelyn watched the exchange silently, her piercing gaze never leaving the older officer. The tension hung in the air, thick and oppressive, until the sound of a phone buzzing cut through it. The younger officer quickly retrieved it, his expression shifting as he read the screen. "Sir," he said cautiously, "the report's been flagged as an error, wrong address." The older officer's face darkened, but he said nothing. Evelyn's steady gaze met his, her silence a reprimand more powerful than any words could be. Without another word, the officers returned to their cars and drove off, the flashing lights fading into the distance. Martha always held herself with unshakable grace, even in moments when the world seemed intent on testing her resolve. But now, standing in the doorway of her own sanctuary, a mix of anger and disbelief weighed heavily on her chest. The officers barged past her without so much as a second glance, their boots leaving dark marks across the polished floors she had tended to with care for years. Her heart sank, but Martha forced herself to remain steady. Raising her voice would only invite more chaos into an already intrusive situation. The men moved through her home like a whirlwind, their actions sharp and dismissive of the history that each object within held. They yanked open drawers, rifled through cabinets, and upended furniture with no thought for the value, sentimental or otherwise, of what they displaced. Picture frames, many of which held irreplaceable snapshots of her son Brandon's journey from boyhood to the city's police commissioner, were tossed aside like yesterday's paper. The sharp sound of glass breaking echoed through the space, and Martha flinched as though the blow had landed on her instead. She tightened her grip on the fabric of her dress, her knuckles pale, her composure unraveling, one trembling breath at a time. Outside, the sounds of the commotion began drawing attention. Curious neighbors gathered near her yard, their quiet conversations occasionally pierced by the clicks of camera phones documenting the unfolding spectacle. Some faces reflected sympathy, others simply watched with a detached curiosity, their phones poised to capture the moment for a digital audience. Among the growing crowd stood Officer Adam Harris, a fresh recruit who had once proudly sworn to protect and serve. Now, as he observed the chaos, his stomach churned with unease. Adam had joined the force with noble intentions, wanting to be a beacon of hope in a system often criticized for its flaws. But this? Watching seasoned officers tear apart an elderly woman's home without explanation or justification felt like a betrayal of everything he'd believed in. He clenched and unclenched his fists, the internal conflict etched onto his face. He had been trained to respect authority and follow orders without question, but the scene before him gnawed at his conscience. The badge on his chest felt heavier than ever, no longer a symbol of justice but a silent weight bearing down on him. Inside, Martha stood motionless in the hallway, her gaze fixed on the officers as they dismantled her sanctuary. Her eyes, though glistening with unshed tears, held a quiet defiance. One of the younger officers paused under her stare, guilt flickering across his face, before he quickly looked away and moved to a different part of the house. The senior officer, however, showed no sign of hesitation or remorse. His every step exuded dominance, his actions brimming with an entitlement that suggested Martha's pain was inconsequential. Martha swallowed hard, her throat dry, as she watched years of memories be treated with callous disregard. The grocery bag she had been clutching slipped from her hands, spilling its contents across the floor. Apples rolled lazily across the polished wood, but Martha made no move to retrieve them. Her lips moved in a silent prayer, a plea for strength and for someone, anyone, to step in and put an end to this violation. The image of her son Brandon fighting for reform within the force came to her mind, but it was bittersweet. Would his efforts ever reach officers like these? Could real change ever come, or would scenes like this continue to play out in countless homes? Outside, the whispers among the neighbors grew louder, their concern and confusion rippling through the gathering crowd. Martha had been a pillar of the community, known for her unwavering kindness and resilience. To see her treated this way stirred both outrage and helplessness among those watching. Parents held their children close, trying to shield them from the tension in the air, though it was impossible to ignore. Adam's pulse quickened as he stood frozen at the edge of the crowd. His breath was shallow, his thoughts racing. If he stepped in, he risked not only his career, but also his standing among his colleagues, people he had to trust with his life in the line of duty. Yet staying silent felt like an even greater betrayal, a denial of the values that had drawn him to law enforcement in the first place. He took a hesitant step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. His heart thundered in his chest as he moved through the cluster of onlookers. The weight of the moment bore down on him like a storm cloud, each step feeling like it might break him. But he couldn't stand by anymore. Something had to change, and it had to start with him. His jaw tightened, and each breath came in measured shallow bursts as he willed his legs to take that first step toward the doorway. The murmuring crowd quieted, their attention snapping to the young officer making his move. Inside, Martha, still rooted in the hallway, caught sight of him from the corner of her tear-streaked eye. Adam's hands trembled at his sides, but he forced himself to take another step, then another, until he stood just inside the entrance. His voice, though soft at first, carried a conviction that silenced the chaos in the room. "Enough," he said, his tone firm despite the pounding in his chest. The senior officer, hunched over a pile of letters he had been rifling through on the dining table, froze mid-motion. Slowly he turned to face Adam, his expression one of pure disdain. "What did you just say?" the man demanded, his voice sharp and cutting. Adam swallowed hard, the weight of every gaze in the room bearing down on him. "This isn't right," he said, his voice steadier now. His eyes shifted to Martha, whose exhausted but hopeful face seemed to give him strength. "We don't have a warrant. We're trampling her rights." The senior officer's jaw clenched, his posture stiffening as he stepped toward Adam, towering over him with an air of intimidation. "You're out of line," he snapped, his voice low and seething with anger. "Stand down or you'll regret it." Adam felt the threat press against him like a heavy hand on his chest. The stakes were clear, and the consequences of his defiance loomed large, but he stood firm. Every lesson he'd learned about integrity and justice echoed in his mind, pushing him forward. "No," he said, his voice unwavering now. "I can't do this. I won't." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension stretching taut. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence now replaced by uncertainty. For the first time, doubt flickered in the senior officer's eyes, his facade of authority beginning to crack. From the hallway, Martha watched the scene unfold with a mixture of fear and admiration. Her chest tightened, her hands clasped together tightly, as if in prayer. The courage Adam was showing, a young officer standing up to his own team, struck her deeply. But she feared for him, knowing the potential fallout of his choice. Outside, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its polished surface gleaming under the afternoon sun. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, their attention shifting as Commissioner Brandon Carter stepped out. His commanding presence alone silenced the growing whispers, his tailored suit and deliberate stride a stark contrast to the disorder around him. Brandon moved through the crowd with a purpose, his expression unreadable, but his every step radiating authority. The onlookers instinctively parted, their curiosity giving way to quiet respect. Or fear. He reached the doorway, his dark, piercing eyes sweeping over the scene inside, cataloging every detail. His heart pounded, not just from fury, but from the cold fear that had gripped him the moment his phone rang. The frantic voice of a neighbor had told him all he needed to know. His mother's sanctuary was under siege. The sight before him only deepened the ache in his chest. As Brandon stepped into the house, silence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The senior officer, who moments earlier exuded dominance, now looked as though the floor might swallow him whole. His confidence dissolved under the commissioner's intense gaze. Brandon's eyes shifted, landing first on Adam. The younger officer stood his ground, his shoulders squared, his expression a mix of fear and fierce determination. Then, Brandon's focus turned to his mother. Martha stood behind Adam, her frail hands trembling but her dignity intact, her gaze locked onto her son, as if he were her last lifeline. Brandon's voice cut through the silence, calm but ice-cold. Somebody had better explain what's going on here. The senior officer stiffened under the weight of the question, his earlier bravado reduced to stammered excuses. "Commissioner, there was, report. Suspicious activity. We were just—" His words stumbled over each other, growing weaker with every syllable. Brandon's jaw clenched, his restraint barely masking the storm of emotions raging beneath the surface. His eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to the senior officer, the unspoken demand for the truth pressing down on everyone in the room. Martha, though weary, couldn't look away. The strength her son exuded filled her with a renewed sense of hope. And Adam, standing resolutely by her side, reminded her that even in the darkest moments, there were still those who stood for what was right. "Suspicious activity," Brandon repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the overturned furniture, drawers pulled out in disarray, family photos scattered like trash, and shards of glass from a shattered frame catching the light on the floor. The anger simmered beneath his calm exterior, every word that followed cutting through the air with precision. "You entered my mother's house without a warrant," he said, his voice growing colder with each passing moment. "You violated her privacy, her dignity, and the law you swore to uphold. Do you understand the weight of what you've done here?" The senior officer's face flushed, and his hands balled into fists at his sides. But before he could utter a word, Adam stepped forward, his voice calm, but filled with the weight of everything that had happened. "Commissioner Carter, I tried to stop them. I knew this wasn't right." Adam's words hung in the air, a quiet but significant admission of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Brandon's gaze softened slightly as he looked at the young officer, his eyes betraying a moment of understanding for the fear Adam must have felt. The senior officer's face reddened, his fists tightening further, but he understood all too well that challenging the commissioner was not an option. Brandon's gaze hardened again, his patience starting to wear thin. "Every officer involved in this will be held accountable," he said with finality, his voice unwavering and filled with the authority that only someone like him could command. The senior officer swallowed, the truth of the situation sinking in. There would be no avoiding the consequences of his actions now. With a quick glance at Adam, Brandon turned to his mother, his demeanor softening as he approached her. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you all right?" Martha's eyes filled with tears, but despite the ordeal, she managed to offer a faint, brave smile. "I'm okay, Brandon," she said, her voice steady despite everything she had just been through. "Thanks to this, young man," she added, nodding toward Adam, who stood with his head bowed, the gravity of the moment weighing heavily on him. Outside, the crowd that had gathered began to murmur again, a renewed energy spreading through them. Neighbors exchanged looks, some murmuring in admiration of Adam's bravery, while others pulled out their phones to capture the moment, eager to share the commissioner's firm stand against abuse of power. Brandon's gaze shifted back to Adam, and he gave a slight nod of respect. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice sincere. "It takes courage to stand up, especially when it's hard." Adam felt the weight of the moment begin to lift as he met Brandon's gaze, a sense of relief flooding through him. The tension in his body melted away as the truth of what had just happened settled in. The crowd outside had grown, and the murmurs of admiration slowly turned into cheers as word spread of the young officer's actions. The story would not end here. What had happened to Martha would be the catalyst for change, the spark that would ignite a movement demanding accountability and respect for the law. In the days that followed, news outlets seized on the story, highlighting the courage of the young officer and the unwavering resolve of the commissioner, who refused to allow the abuse of power to go unchallenged. Brandon worked tirelessly to push for reform, ensuring that no one else would endure the same violation that his mother had. Martha, too, found herself at the center of a movement, her quiet strength inspiring others to step forward, speak out, and demand better treatment from those who were supposed to protect them. For Adam, the experience marked the beginning of a new chapter. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that, despite the challenges, he had made a difference. And for Martha, the dove-shaped brooch she had worn throughout her life now symbolized something far deeper than just peace. It had become a symbol of the resilience that had carried her through life's trials, and the hope that, even in the darkest of times, there were still those willing to stand up for what was right.